Private Thomas Whitfield hunched over his telegraph key in the dimly lit communications bunker, his fingers flying across the brass instrument as urgent messages crackled through the wire from British headquarters 15 miles behind the front lines. At 22 years old, he was one of the youngest telegraph operators in the British Expeditionary Force, but his exceptional skill with Morse code and his photographic memory for message protocols had made him indispensable to military communications operations along the Somme sector. But on this fog-shrouded morning in July 1916, as he decoded a routine artillery fire mission, Thomas noticed a critical error that would send British shells crashing down on their own troops unless he acted immediately. The message had originated from Divisional Artillery Command, transmitted through multiple relay stations before reaching Thomas's position near the frontline trenches. Standard procedure required him to decode the coordinates, verify the authentication codes, and immediately transmit the fire mission to artillery batteries positioned 3 miles to the rear. The entire process typically took less than 2 minutes, with telegraph operators trained to prioritize speed over detailed analysis of message content. Thomas had been serving as a military telegraph operator since enlisting in August 1914, just days after Britain declared war on Germany. His background had prepared him well for the technical demands of military communications. His father operated the telegraph office in their small Yorkshire village, and Thomas had learned Morse code before he could read conventional text. By age 12, he could receive and transmit messages at speeds that exceeded most professional operators. When war erupted, Thomas had initially been rejected for infantry service due to poor eyesight that made him unsuitable for combat duties. But a recruiting officer had recognized his telegraph skills during the medical examination, immediately recommending him for the Royal Corps of Signals, where his technical abilities would be far more valuable than rifle marksmanship. Within weeks of enlisting, Thomas found himself operating communications equipment that connected frontline units with headquarters staff, coordinating operations across the entire Western Front. The British offensive on the Somme had begun on July 1st with catastrophic results. Over 60,000 British casualties on the first day alone, making it the bloodiest day in British military history. The disaster had resulted partly from communications failures that prevented commanders from coordinating infantry attacks with artillery support, leading to waves of soldiers advancing into German machine gun fire without adequate covering fire. In the 2 weeks following the initial assault, British commanders had been desperately trying to improve communication systems to prevent similar disasters during subsequent attacks. New procedures were implemented for verifying artillery coordinates, additional telegraph relay stations were established to reduce transmission errors, and operators like Thomas received enhanced training in message authentication protocols designed to prevent friendly fire incidents. What would you do if you noticed a small error that could result in hundreds of deaths? The fire mission that Thomas was decoding on the morning of July 15th appeared routine at first glance, a request for artillery bombardment of suspected German positions in a sector designated as grid reference 247893. The coordinates placed the target area approximately 800 yards beyond British frontline trenches, well within the range where German defensive positions had been identified by aerial reconnaissance. But something about the coordinates triggered Thomas's intuitive sense that years of telegraph work had developed. His numbers seemed familiar in a way that suggested he had processed similar coordinates recently, though he couldn't immediately recall this specific context. His photographic memory, which allowed him to remember virtually every message he had transmitted during his military service, was alerting him to potential problems even before his conscious mind had identified the specific issue. Thomas paused the transmission process to review the coordinates more carefully, comparing them against mental maps of the battlefield that he had constructed from hundreds of previous messages. Within seconds, he realized the source of his unease. The coordinates in the fire mission were identical to those he had transmitted just 2 days earlier in a message about British troop movements into new forward positions. The implications were immediately and horrifyingly clear. The fire mission was targeting coordinates where British forces had recently deployed, not German defensive positions. If the artillery bombardment proceeded as ordered, British shells would fall directly on British troops, causing casualties that could number in the hundreds depending on how many soldiers were in the target area. Thomas's first instinct was to halt the transmission immediately, and report the coordinate discrepancy to his commanding officer. But military communication protocols were extremely rigid, especially regarding artillery fire missions, where delays could result in missed tactical opportunities or allow enemy forces to escape bombardment. Operators who questioned or delayed authorized messages faced severe disciplinary action, including court-martial for insubordination if their concerns proved unfounded. The decision Thomas faced was both technical and moral. As a telegraph operator, his duty was to transmit authorized messages quickly and accurately, not to analyze tactical decisions made by superior officers who had access to intelligence information that operators never saw. But as a human being who understood that his actions could prevent a massacre of British soldiers, he felt compelled to verify the coordinates before transmitting orders that could result in catastrophic friendly fire. Have you ever had to choose between following procedures and preventing a disaster you alone could see coming? Thomas made a split-second decision that violated every communications protocol he had been taught, but reflected the moral clarity that sometimes emerges during moments of crisis. Rather than immediately transmitting the fire mission or reporting his concerns through official channels, that could take precious time, he sent an urgent message directly to the artillery battery that would execute the bombardment, requesting confirmation of target coordinates and specifically noting the potential for friendly fire based on a recent troop deployment information. The response from the artillery battery came within 90 seconds. A terse acknowledgement that they were holding fire pending coordinate verification, along with a demand for Thomas's authorization to question a properly authenticated fire mission from divisional command. The artillerymen were clearly confused about why a junior telegraph operator was intervening in tactical decisions that were far above his authority level. But Thomas's unauthorized message had achieved its primary objective, preventing immediate execution of an artillery bombardment that would have killed British soldiers. Now he faced the challenge of proving that his concerns were legitimate before superior officers ordered the fire mission to proceed or initiated disciplinary action against him for insubordination and interference with military operations. Thomas quickly composed a message to his commanding officer, Captain Harrison, explaining the coordinate discrepancy and requesting immediate verification before the artillery mission proceeded. He included specific details about the previous message regarding British troop deployments, providing Harrison with enough information to conduct independent verification without requiring extensive investigation. The response from Captain Harrison demonstrated the value of having experienced officers who understood that rigid adherence to protocols could sometimes be catastrophic. Rather than immediately disciplining Thomas for questioning authorized orders, Harrison recognized the validity of his concerns and initiated emergency procedures to verify the fire mission coordinates before any shells were launched. The verification process that followed revealed exactly what Thomas had suspected. The artillery fire mission contained coordinates that had been corrupted during transmission through multiple relay stations. A single-digit error in the grid reference had transformed coordinates pointing to German positions into coordinates that targeted British forward positions where over 300 soldiers were preparing for a planned attack scheduled for later that day. The source of the error was eventually traced to a malfunctioning telegraph relay station that had introduced systematic distortions into coordinates during retransmission. The technical problem had gone undetected because authentication codes had remained intact, creating a situation where corrupted messages appeared legitimate to standard verification procedures. Share your thoughts in the comments below about trusting your instincts when official procedures seem wrong. The immediate consequence of Thomas's intervention was the cancellation of an artillery bombardment that would have killed hundreds of British soldiers and potentially compromised the planned attack that depended on those forces. But the broader impact extended far beyond that single prevented disaster, as his discovery of the relay station malfunction led to a comprehensive review of communications telegraph systems throughout the British Expeditionary Force. The technical investigation revealed that similar coordinate corruption had affected numerous messages over the previous weeks, though most errors had been detected through other verification procedures or had resulted in artillery fire falling in unoccupied areas where the mistakes went unnoticed. But the potential for catastrophic friendly fire incidents had been present throughout the communication system, creating risks that could have resulted in massive casualties if operators had followed protocols without questioning suspicious coordinates. Captain Harrison's report on the incident credited Thomas with preventing a significant friendly fire disaster while also identifying systematic problems in communications infrastructure that threatened military operations throughout the Somme offensive. The technical investigation recommended both recognition for Thomas's initiative and immediate reforms to telegraph verification procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. The British Army's response to Thomas's discovery reflected the tension between maintaining military discipline and encouraging individual initiative when circumstances warranted deviation from standard procedures. Senior commanders recognized that Thomas had technically violated communications protocols by questioning an authorized fire mission, but they also understood that his actions had prevented a disaster that could have undermined the entire Somme offensive. The resolution came in the form of new communications procedures that institutionalized the kind of verification that Thomas had performed intuitively. Telegraph operators were given explicit authorization to question coordinates that appeared inconsistent with known troop positions, while additional verification checkpoints were implemented to catch transmission errors before they could result in friendly fire incidents. Thomas received a commendation for his actions, though the official citation was carefully worded to avoid suggesting that questioning authorized orders was generally appropriate behavior for junior enlisted personnel. The commendation recognized his exceptional attention to detail and initiative in preventing a potential communications error, language that acknowledged his achievement while maintaining the principle that military discipline required adherence to established procedures. But the more significant recognition came from the 300 British soldiers who had been in the target area when the erroneous fire mission was transmitted. Word spread quickly through the trenches about the telegraph operator who had saved an entire battalion from being killed by their own artillery, creating a reputation that followed Thomas throughout the remainder of his military service. The psychological impact on Thomas of realizing that his moment of hesitation had prevented hundreds of deaths was profound and lasting. He understood that if he had simply followed standard procedures without questioning the suspicious coordinates, he would have been technically correct in his actions, but morally responsible for a massacre of British soldiers. The recognition that individual judgment sometimes must supersede institutional procedures became a defining principle that influenced his approach to both military service and civilian life. Let us know in the comments what you think about the responsibility of questioning authority when lives are at stake. Thomas continued serving as a military telegraph operator throughout the remainder of the war, participating in communications operations during major offensives at Passchendaele, Cambrai, and the final Allied advances of 1918. His reputation as the operator who had prevented the Somme friendly fire incident preceded him to each new assignment, creating expectations that he would maintain the same vigilance and initiative that had characterized his actions in July 1916. But Thomas also carried the psychological burden of understanding that his intervention had been necessary only because communication systems and verification procedures had been inadequate to prevent catastrophic errors. He became an advocate for improved telegraph technology and more robust verification protocols, writing detailed technical reports about communications vulnerabilities and recommending specific improvements that could prevent future incidents. The technical reforms that Thomas advocated were gradually implemented throughout British military communication systems, contributing to improved coordination between artillery and infantry forces that helped reduce friendly fire incidents during subsequent operations. His specific recommendations about coordinate verification procedures became standard practice in military telegraph operations, influencing communications protocols that remained in effect long after the war ended. After the armistice in November 1918, Thomas returned to civilian life in Yorkshire, where he initially planned to resume working in his father's telegraph office. But his wartime experiences had convinced him that communications technology required continued innovation and improvement, leading him to pursue advanced technical education in electrical engineering and communications systems. Thomas eventually became one of Britain's leading experts in telecommunications technology, contributing to the development of automated verification systems that could detect transmission errors without requiring human operators to intuitively recognize suspicious patterns. His innovations influenced both military communications and civilian telegraph systems, improving reliability and safety in applications ranging from railway signaling to international diplomatic communications. In 1956, 40 years after the incident that had defined his military service, Thomas was interviewed by military historians researching British communications operations during World War I. During the interview, Thomas reflected on the moral and technical aspects of his decision to question the erroneous fire mission, emphasizing that technological systems must always include provisions for human judgment when automated procedures prove inadequate. Communication systems exist to serve human needs, not to dictate human behavior, Thomas explained in the interview. When procedures conflict with common sense or moral necessity, individuals must have both the authority and the courage to question those procedures. My training taught me to transmit messages quickly and accurately, but my conscience taught me that preventing a massacre was more important than following regulations. Thomas Whitfield died in 1973 at age 79, having lived long enough to see his telegraph innovations transformed by computer technology and digital communications that made the brass telegraph keys of his military service seem like ancient artifacts. But the fundamental principle he had demonstrated, that individual judgment and moral courage must sometimes override institutional procedures, remains relevant regardless of technological changes. The telegraph key that Thomas had used during his military service, including the morning when he prevented the friendly fire disaster, was eventually donated to the Imperial War Museum, where it is displayed alongside his commendation and excerpts from Captain Harrison's report describing the incident. The display serves as a reminder that technological systems, no matter how sophisticated, depend ultimately on the judgment and courage of individuals who operate them. Today, Thomas's story is taught in military communications training programs as an example of how operators must balance adherence to procedures with situational awareness and moral responsibility. His decision to question an authorized fire mission that appeared technically correct but intuitively wrong represents the kind of initiative that military organizations must encourage even while maintaining the discipline necessary for effective operations. Private Thomas Whitfield proved that individual vigilance and moral courage can prevent disasters even when institutional procedures and technological systems fail to detect critical errors. His legacy demonstrates that the most important decisions are sometimes made not by commanders planning grand strategies, but by junior personnel who recognize that something is wrong and have the courage to speak up regardless of personal consequences. The 300 British soldiers who survived because Thomas questioned suspicious coordinates never forgot the telegraph operator who saved their lives through a moment of careful attention and moral courage. Their testimony ensured that his contribution would be remembered and honored, demonstrating that heroism often takes the form of quiet professionalism rather than dramatic gestures, and that individual integrity can make the difference between tragedy and survival.